Tulo, tulo, tulo. Ulavanaka, kia ora koutou katoa, talofa lava, malolele, whakalofa lahiatu, mori, maloni, whakatalofa atu, you all right? Hello oketa, hello kona mori. I'm Mandy Tregus, President of the Australian Association for Pacific Studies, and I'd like to extend warm Pacific greetings to you all. We've got a small group in the room and a lot of people across Australia, Aotearoa, New Zealand, and in the Pacific. We're meeting here on the traditional lands of the Kaurna people, and I acknowledge their elders past and present. I also acknowledge their custodianship of these unceded lands over millennia, and also acknowledge all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are present and First Nations peoples everywhere. This is the Epeli Hau'ofa Lecture. Epeli was the founder and director of the Oceania Centre for Arts and Culture at USP in Suva, and he'd lived much of his life in Papua New Guinea, Tonga and Fiji. He's especially remembered for his influential essays, Our Sea of Islands and the Ocean in Us, which have helped to indigenise Pacific studies in increasingly fruitful ways, especially by his understanding that the Pacific Islanders are connected by the ocean and that identity is produced by interaction and through that ocean, the Great Moana. We've had some wonderful lectures in the years since it's been instituted, and today I'm really pleased to welcome Professor Jioji Ravulo, Professor and Chair of Social Work and Policy Studies at the Sydney School of Education and Social Work at the University of Sydney. His research, writing and areas of interest include mental health and wellbeing, alcohol and other drugs, youth development, marginality and decoloniality. He's involved in various community-based research and co-design initiatives, including projects that support health literacies across equity groups, enhancing service delivery models for young people and their families, promoting the inclusion of diversity in educational settings, and supporting the meaningful inclusion of Indigenous perspectives and practices. Now, this talk is, it's called a lecture, but it's going to have some conversational aspects. We're going to have some talanoa. Unfortunately, we don't have the kava bowl in the middle, but so we have a Q&A function, and the idea is that if you have a question, you can indicate that in the Q&A and also indicate whether you would like to put that question yourself, whether we can turn that on so that you can speak. You may prefer to put your question just in text in the Q&A and even in the chat. So we'll try and follow that throughout, and we'll take Jioji's lead on this. I'd like to hand over to him. His topic is decoloniality, desistance, resistance and reclamation, striving for social justice and inclusive societies. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Nakvakalevu. Nisam Bulavanaka, and good day. Hi, everyone. Hi. It's good to see you all, and it's lovely to be here in space at the University of Adelaide. I'm going to start sharing my screen and we'll go from there. So this afternoon, we're going to be looking at the topic area up on the screen, decoloniality, desistance, resistance and reclamation, striving for social justice and inclusive societies. And I'm hoping from our shared conversation this afternoon, wherever you might be located, that this will be the start of an ongoing talanoa, a shared conversation around the way in which we understand spaces and places in which we all traverse. I'm mindful also that because we are looking at Pasifika or Pacific Indigenous peoples, we're also mindful of the way in which we work alongside and collaboratively with Pacific Indigenous people where we're located across the region and beyond. Before I continue on, I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands in which we're all joining this webinar from. I also acknowledge the traditional owners, the Kaurna people of this particular region. Also, a lot of my work is done on campus at the University of Sydney, so that's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and also where I'm located where I live is on the lands of the Dharawal people. So I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I also acknowledge acknowledge that the lands in which we are zooming in from and joining this webinar, they're still considered stolen because sovereignty was never ceded, always was, always will be Aboriginal land. So it's very, very important that we also continue to see our own role and responsibility in working collaboratively with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. I'm going to encourage people joining us via the webinar to also acknowledge the traditional lands in which they're located on. It would be great for you to also contribute to that shared acknowledgement. And you might also be joining us from the Indigenous lands from across Oceania in Aotearoa and other traditional lands across the Pacific region itself. So I'd encourage you to say hello. And I'm seeing that already, which is great. I'm seeing people saying hello to each other. I'm also hoping that from this conversation today that we'll continue to see how Pacific Indigenous perspectives play out in space and place, and how we too can be more meaningful or more mindful as well around how we do that in our respective roles. So I always start by asking a reflection question. And so I'm going to encourage everyone to reflect with me on this reflection question, making sense. What helps you to make sense of the world around you? What helps you to make sense of the world around you? So I want people to reflect. If you'd like to contribute via the chat, please do. But I'm also going to encourage the people that are in this physical space with me to also provide some feedback on this reflection question. What helps you to make sense of the world around you? What are we thinking? Who would like to share here in this space? Normally, if I'm in a lecture theatre, well, this is like a lecture theatre, I would pass the microphone to someone directly. So they would have the microphone and they would have to contribute. Hi.
Yeah,
We'll pick you up.
I'm overthinking it. I don't overthink many things. But yeah, so for me, I'm originally from Aotearoa. I come from sort of a Maori family and Maori background. So whakapapa, which sort of means genealogy. Helps me to make a lot of sense of the world about thinking that, well, one, sort of there's a reason why I'm here that comes from many different strands and different strands of interconnectedness. As sort of Mandy prefaced with the ocean, we're talking about why we're here. And and sort of saying like, those all those different reasons, and especially those family reasons of what's provided for me to be here, from Tipuna sort of being, whether that be ancestors or whether that be from the land or from Moana. So all those things being interconnected. So. Yeah,
awesome. Thank you so much. Really appreciate that. Other people in the room, and then I'm also going to go to the chat. I'm seeing the chat light up, which is great. Maybe I'll go to the chat because we're getting all these great comments. So we've got things like family, and we've got connecting with others, critical thinking and reading, soft breezes, starry nights and poems. I like that, it's very reflective. Relationships, my community, who I'm related to biologically, and stories and events from the past that informs the present, dialogue, discussing with peers, relationship with people and the environment in which I live and work, language, family and ancestral connections. This is great. So we've also got things like knowing who I am and where I come from. All right. So I think people are sort of getting as to why I'm asking this reflection question. I think what we're seeing here is that where we've come from, or how we make sense of the world, or how we navigate and negotiate spaces and places, does definitely come from our own lived experiences, but how we also utilize those lived experiences can also shape where we might be going in the future. And I'm going to suggest that off the back of this particular lecture and conversation, that being able to understand the contexts and understanding the bigger picture of where you're from and where you've come from and what that means for today will also determine what happens in the future, but also understanding that it's very varied. The way in which we make sense of the world is very, very varied. And one of the key things that we need to be mindful of is how do we do this in collaborative, collegial and collective ways where everyone is able to be part of socially just and inclusive societies. Okay, so that's a bigger picture of what I'm looking at today. But I'm also going to be, of course, looking at Pacific Indigenous perspectives as part of this shared approach and how this pervades and permeates the way in which we also make sense of the world around us, especially from a Pacific studies point of view, whilst also working collaboratively with those involved in this space. I'm going to continue on, and I wanted to provide this context of what I'll be talking about as well today. So I was very fortunate. I unexpectedly had to go back to Fiji a couple of months ago. I had a passing in my family. So it took me back to Fiji in Suva. And on one of the days before I came back to Australia, I went up to the University of South Pacific and spent time in space at the Oceania Arts Centre, where Epeli himself created the space. Because I had just been invited to do this lecture. So I was like, what better place to go to the place in which this all started. And for me, I just realised it's a typo there. For me, it was about being able to ensure that I was going to be conscious, and I'm going to fix this typo because this does matter. Okay. For me, it was about being able to contextualise what I was also going to be talking about today. And I found, I don't know if people have actually gone to this particular space at the University of the South Pacific. It's up on the hill. It's next to this big bure, but unfortunately they've knocked down that bure. I know, right? God. I know. So that's where the centre was the centre is still located there. But they used to have this big bure at the front there. So I'm still trying to figure out what happened there. But nonetheless, it was awesome being able to be in this space and place. And in this particular space and place, there's this performance space on campus there. And on one of the pillars, there is this quote that's on one of the pillars. And I sat in reflection with this particular quote, and I wanted to utilise this as part of our shared conversation today. And apologies again, there's a typo that I see there. Let me read this out. We are the sea. We are the ocean. We must wake up to this ancient truth and together use it to overturn all hegemonic views that aim to ultimately confine us again, physically and psychologically, in the tiny spaces that we have resisted, accepting as our sole appointment, places and from which we have recently liberated ourselves. We must not allow anyone to belittle us again and take away our freedom. Now, as a Pacific Indigenous person myself, my father is Ipolkei Fijian, Indigenous Fijian. I strive to navigate and negotiate my own understanding of what these particular perspectives might mean. But when you look at something like this particular quote from Dr. Hau'ofa, you can see that it really resonates with this idea of how do we, as Pacific Indigenous people, continue to ensure that what was told of us previously, especially in modern contexts, what was told of us doesn't stop us from actually moving forward. If anything, it's about being able to reclaim a lot of the ways in which we previously understood self as a means to actually moving forward. And that's a big part. When we look at the way in which we traditionally or currently see ourselves as Pacific people, as Pacific Indigenous people and people that are Indigenous of the Pacific, it's very easy for us to see where we're currently located and use that to shape our worldviews. However, my challenge is that we all, as Pacific Indigenous people and other people working alongside Pacific Indigenous people, need to be mindful of how we can continue to do exactly what Dr. Hau'ofa is asking us to do here. which is not to, once again, relegate Pacific Indigenous people into spaces and places that deter our inclusion, that deter our ability to utilise what we know and where we've come from to shape what we are and who we are and what that means as part of our engagement locally, regionally, and globally. So I'm going to suggest that as part of our shared conversation, I'm going to really unpack and highlight these 4 key words in creating socially just and fair societies. And I'm very happy to make these slides also available as part of our shared conversation today. And I'll make sure I fix up the typos. So these are 4 key words: decoloniality, desistance, resistance, and reclamation. So these are the 4 words that I'm going to suggest needs to occur with everyone, not just Pacific Indigenous people, but everyone. And from reading Dr. Hau'ofa's material, this, I believe, was part of his own thinking about not just relegating us as Pacific people in sections of the region and saying, hey, this is what we do, and just sort of leave us to our own devices. No, we're part of a bigger conversation. It's very much being part of this shared approach. And so for me, being involved in Pacific studies or looking at studying people from Pacific backgrounds and what we're about and who we are is about working together, not just about being able to understand us from an arm's length. So this is a big part of looking at these four key words, and I'm now going to unpack them as we go along. I'm going to ask people some key things as we go as well. Okay, so let's look at. So I'm going to suggest that there's some general definitions that come with each of these keywords, but I'm going to provide you with a context as to what these mean based on my understanding of what we're trying to achieve. So let's start with the first one, decoloniality. And one day I will be able to say that word correctly the first time. So for me, decoloniality is about meaningful inclusion. For me, it's about examining the role of modernity across Pasifika spaces. It's also examining the role of Pasifika across modernity. So it's this idea of what does this mean to understand when we are looking at Pacific people in spaces and places, whether in our countries of origin or in the diaspora, how does modernity or contemporary context shape our worldview and our understanding of self and others? But vice versa, how does the role of our own Pasifika perspective shape the way in which we make sense of modernity, contemporary approaches and perspectives? So for me, decoloniality is about understanding how we actually make meaning of those particular perspectives in space and place. It's also understanding and unlocking the binaries that perpetuate division. So it's very, very easy to go into respective spaces and go, well, this is a traditional Pacific way of doing it, and this is a modern way of doing it. And sometimes the traditional does not enter the modern context. They should never meet because that's what we used to do back in the day, and that's not related or relevant to today. And I think it's within those particular binaries that we perpetuate this division of what is included and what's not included. And I think that this is very unhelpful when it comes to understanding the possibilities. And when I'm talking about the binaries, I also look at this idea of westernized perspectives across Pasifika spaces. So a lot of time we do perpetuate this particular binary around West is best and white is right. And we take those perspectives into, when we engage Pasifika people, we take these perspectives into those binaries into the way in which we make sense of Pasifika people and places and spaces. So for me, it's about working towards a shared conversation with everyone. I think the idea of indigenisation is so important in being able to provide Indigenous communities with scope to reimagine and re-indigenise spaces and places. I think that's very, very important as part of that shared approach. At the same time, I think decoloniality is all about being able to provide scope for everyone to be part of the conversation. Because traditionally, I think at times with indigenisation, we sort of go, okay, we'll just let the Indigenous people sort of get on with it and do their thing. But then we as a broader community fail to actually see our role in possibly perpetuating their ongoing divide in society. At the same time, we're not actively learning along with Indigenous communities. So for me, decoloniality is all about being able to promote scope for everyone to be part of the conversation. Let me now give you an example. So what I'm doing in this particular lecture is also providing you with those keywords, and then I'm going to provide you with examples of how I've been involved in trying to hold myself accountable for the way in which I practice these particular keywords and perspectives. So I've been involved in developing this particular collection of work called Pacific Social Work. And this was off the back of my engagement with the broader professional social work community in decolonising our professional identity. When I first told my dad I was going into social work, he was like, yeah, no, you're not doing that. And one of the reasons where I've realised this later on in life is because he didn't really understand what social work was. Why? Because the concept of social work is what we do in everyday life within Pacific communities. We've got key concepts like Solosolovaki and Bengaravi, where we just serve people and we respect people and we understand. So this idea of creating a profession to do that, what does that mean? So a lot of the work of social work in the Pacific region has been imported by the West, from Western societies into the islands themselves, and even imposed on the diaspora here in Australia and in New Zealand and other places globally. So this particular edited collection, which has 20 chapters and over 40 contributors to each of those particular chapters, because we're very keen to ensure that we had 2 to 3 people on each chapter. We had Pacific people who were both in academic and practice roles or in research roles, and also those that were coming to join the chapters from a lived experience. And we wanted to ensure that we were able to do this, what's the definition of what we try to do as what Pacific social work is. So it's about centering Pacific Indigenous ways of knowing and doing, being and becoming for community, family, and individual well-being, whilst counteracting structural, cultural, and personal oppressions within Oceania and throughout the diaspora. So for us, it was taking, yes, some of the key concepts that we might learn from Western social work, but it was very much around how do we decolonise the way in which the profession positions itself, especially in its connection with Pacific people in the various spaces and places in which social work might engage. So for me, it was about not just encouraging non-Pacific people to centre Pacific Indigenous ways of knowing and doing, being and becoming, but even myself as someone that's been trained up in social work, even my involvement in supporting the social work program at the University of the South Pacific, traditionally a lot of the content within that comes from outside of the region. So that was the other endeavour of creating this collection. We wanted to be able to provide written material for Pacific by Pacific, whilst also sharing that broader conversation with everyone, not just Pacific people, but with everyone. Any comments or questions so far? Before I go into the next keyword or concept, feel free to add anything in the chat. What are people thinking so far? That's the other question that I generally ask people to provide feedback. What are people thinking? What are you thinking at the moment?
I'm wondering because formal social systems in the Pacific can often not be a thing. right? Depending on which country you're talking about and which context. So systems in which families, communities, things like domestic violence, any form of violence or structural issues get sorted often happen in the more cultural context rather than through departments and programs and organizations that are dedicated to those sorts of things. And that's been the way it's been in the Pacific for a long time, especially things to do with mental health, mental health, well-being, that sort of thing. So I am very curious how this would work in the islands compared with like Aotearoa, New Zealand, Australia, other places that have departments, programs, infrastructure systems. Like, how does this play out? Because I get the concept, but then the application of it in the islands is quite challenging. And definitely this concept of modernity versus the way we've been doing things for centuries comes into clashes, because then you have issues around gender, family, patriarchy, hierarchy, Christianity, inter-Pacific racism, a whole gamut of issues that,
Completely agree with you. Completely agree with you. A lot of our authors actually came from the islands themselves. And that was the idea. We wanted to ensure that this was truly a regional book. And a lot of the key concepts, because there's 20 chapters and there's 14 chapters that are specifically dedicated to different fields of practice that you see social work in. So domestic and family violence, we've got things like mental health, youth offending, a whole range of different fields. There's 14 of them. And what we were striving to do was exactly what you just said. So how do we ensure that Pacific epistemologies and ontologies and even approaches through those particular lenses and perspectives were meaningfully incorporated in the way in which these approaches were understood? So even in regards to sexual and reproductive health, understanding some of the context, that's a chapter in this book as well, understanding some of the context in which traditional practices play out. So that was that. And I agree with you. I think it's key that we continue to work together on understanding those lived realities, as opposed to, again, throwing these particular professions or structures or departments into the mix. Because traditionally, this is what happens. A lot of the Western views and values are transported from these paternalistic countries like ours to the region as a means to go, well, that's development. But I think it's counterintuitive to development. Yeah. Awesome. And some comments from on the chat, making the best of both worlds. Yes. And I'm glad I know there is this book. Great, thank you. Go check it out. I think most university libraries do have a copy, so I'd encourage you to check out this book. And yes, continue to engage critically, because that's the same. We created this collection. It was published in 2019, and I was speaking to some of my co-authors and co-editors recently, and I was like, we need to further evolve this stuff as well. Totally. All right, let's move on to the second concept, which is around desistance. Now, what's really interesting is that traditionally this particular word or concept, desistance, is generally found within criminology, this idea of someone moving away from offending. And I've borrowed this particular concept to actually suggest that, again, going back to this notion of structures and systemic inequalities within our societies, they're the ones that continue to offend against Pasifika people. So I'm suggesting that we need to promote scope for systems and structures, including the peoples within them, to desist, to stop offending against us as Pasifika people, to ensure that they are part of, again, a shared approach of moving forward. So it's about being able to promote accountability. It's about producing acceptance and provoking change. For me, it's about doing this through a shared approach to ensure people are held accountable whilst accepting responsibility and creating change for just approaches. What I'm saying about desistance is that we're moving away from privileging white Western perspectives as the norm, as being the status quo, as being what we accept as just what we do around here. And unfortunately, again, when we go into the islands themselves, we sort of go into some of those spaces thinking that this is what we are expected to be doing, as opposed to looking at the way in which we might privilege Pacific Indigenous ways of knowing and doing, being and becoming. We're all part of this. I have to check my privilege when I go to the islands because I've been educated here in Western systems and structures. I continue to perpetuate some of those power imbalances by virtue of just being involved in a university. So I'm talking about myself here when I'm thinking about being involved in desistance, not pointing the finger to other people. We're all part of this. It's all about us being able to move away from, again, creating practices and approaches, replicating structures and systems that are not aware of the way in which we privilege one over the other. So it's even going back to this notion of the binary. So just a quick, an example of how I've seen and or done or working across this. So I've been involved now over the last couple of years in being able to look at disrupting whiteness in social work. So this book was published a couple of years after the Pacific Social Work book. So this came out in a year after 2020. And then in that particular chapter that I was involved in writing for this particular book on disrupting whiteness in social work, once again, I'm calling out the way in which we utilize and replicate white perspective. So I should actually stop and say, when I'm talking about whiteness, I'm not talking about skin color, okay? So I need to say that. I'm not talking about skin color. What I'm talking about when it comes to whiteness is power imbalances and power structures that are unjust and unfair and continue to privilege one way of doing things. Okay, that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about whiteness. Okay, so I'm not calling people out for their skin color. I really am not. Okay, I'm just calling about this idea and the way in which we just, especially in Western countries, we expect that this is what we do. And again, when I've gone into the islands and done work across the region, it continues to intrigue me that we've even been convinced that what we are bringing from countries like Australia and New Zealand is going to be right for the Pacific. And we need to call this out again. So really what I'm saying is that through this notion of desistance, it's about calling it out. The other thing I'm involved in at the moment is this handbook of critical whiteness, deconstructing dominant discourses across disciplines. I have a thing for D words. So if you're interested in contributing, hit me up via email. We're still looking for contributors. But basically in this handbook that Springer is going to be publishing in the next year or so, we're trying to call out whiteness across different disciplines and how it continues to permeate people's worldviews. Now, for me, this is not explicitly Pacific, but as the lead editor on this project, I'm taking my Pasifika lived experience of understanding whiteness to this conversation. I'm taking my understanding of what it means to be involved in situations and circumstances where a whiteness occurs based on the way in which I've been treated and or understood. Professor Katerina Tewa recently became a professor. Her and I, apart from someone else, we're the only, I think there's 3 of us now from Pacific Indigenous heritages that are professors in Australia. It's 2022, people. Why has this occurred? I mean, it's awesome that we're professors, right? Love it, love it, love it, right? But it took so long for us as Pacific Indigenous people to be recognised in these respective spaces. The legacy that Professor Tewa has in regards to the breadth and the depth of the knowledge and the work, and we rely then on the Western white structures to justify and give credence to that. That's what we're calling out. And that's as Pasifika people, we need to be aware of our own perspectives on these particular approaches. Any comments or questions on this?
I liked your comment earlier on about West is best and white is right.
Yes.
I'm very Anglo. All my grandparents are English. My mother was English. And although I don't feel guilty about Britain sending convicts and troops and whatever to Australia, I just don't see colonialism as being the right thing to do. It's not been, it seems from my, as a member of the general public, as much as anything, from my perspective, there doesn't seem to be very many occasions where it's worked really well.
Yes, I agree. And
anywhere around the world.
Yes. Look, I agree and I appreciate that.
And Australian Aborigines, and I don't know about Pacific Islanders, Black Africans, managed to survive and even thrive. For 50,000 years in Australia, we say 40, 50, 60,000. I don't think it matters whether it's 40 or 60. It's a long, 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 long time. They managed to live quite comfortably, apparently, for 50,000 years.
Yep.
And then these white people come in and say, oh, no, that's not the right way. Oh, no, 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 no.
Yep.
So, as I say, terribly Anglo. And I can't, in a lot of ways, relate to islanders and the notion of we belong to the ocean and that sort of thing, or the Australian Aborigines and the land. I understand it intellectually, but I don't feel it. But I can see that it is right for them.
Yep, thank you.
And for white people, whether they were English or Portuguese or Dutch or any other thing, to wander in and say, your way is not right.
Yeah. Not helpful. Not helpful. Thank you for those comments. Look, I agree. I think it is about this idea of how do we continue to, again, privilege one way over another. And it is unhelpful. We then don't create socially inclusive societies as a result of privileging one over the other. And it's really interesting. I was actually meant to, I'll give you this example, and I'll just actually take it to the chat. Desistance needs to be preached loudly to regional and international development agencies working in the Pacific region. I completely agree with that. Dr. Michael Mohammed Ahmed might be, yes, I agree. That'd be great. Thank you. And Christianity and colonisation. Yes, I'm going to get to that one very soon. And a great example is the New Zealand education system that continues to label Pasifika Māori as priority learners. Yes. So it's all these particular things that have just come up on the chat as well that continues to perpetuate this us and them. Okay. And the example I was just going to give is that I was actually meant to arrive into Adelaide yesterday afternoon, but I had to change my flight because I was asked to go and be involved in a garden party with Her Royal Highness Princess Anne at the Government House in Sydney. So that was a thing, and that was something that, because I sit on this particular committee that is involved in, she's the patron of this particular committee that I'm involved in. Where was that invitation, Jioji? Yeah, I agree. And it's funny, as I told Mandy that I had to change my flights, I said, I'm coming to do a talk on decolonisation and this idea of disrupting whiteness, right? And yet I'm still involved in these respective spaces. And I even said that to my colleagues yesterday at Government House. I said, oh my gosh, tomorrow I'm flying to Adelaide to talk about this. And it's almost like this compare and contrast, and these two should never meet. But on further reflection, I think for me, it's about being able to be involved in these conversations, especially if we are all willing to have these conversations. So it's about calling it out, even in these spaces where we might be present, and allowing those that may have previously perpetuated power imbalances to also do what I was suggesting on the last slide, to be accountable, to understand acceptance, and to provoke change through those conversations. So yes, I will continue to go to those particular, interactions, but I still go, oh, it's really strange, just in the way in which these things may occur. There's a comment here: how do parts of decoloniality, scope of everyone to be part of the conversation, work with parts of desistance, disrupting whiteness? Are they complementary or conflicting? Well, I'd like to think that they're both, that they are complementary and conflicting. So I'm of the view that it's okay to have tension. Tension is a good thing, and a lot of this stuff around the binary comes from philosophers like Derrida, Jacques Derrida, that talks about this idea of difference and this idea of being able to live within the greys and understand. So I know that's a Western philosophy, but I think there's a lot to be learnt around this idea of how do we create scope to ensure that there is a shared conversation on these particular things. All right, let's continue on. The next concept that I'm going to talk about is resistance. And this is very much around this idea of making a stand and how we might be able to do these key things. So how do we continue to support a shared conversation to transform approaches that traditionally dictate and determine outcomes? And how do we create research practices and participation that privileges Pacific voices and views? So what I'm suggesting with resistance is, as Pacific Indigenous people, so I am now calling out to all Pacific Indigenous people, that we are involved in supporting a shared conversation, that we are actually involved in being able to dictate and determine outcomes. And we're also involved in ensuring that when we are working alongside, especially academic spaces like research, that we are involved in applying research approaches and methodologies that run hand in hand with privileging our voices and our views. Okay, that's really what I'm saying with this idea of resistance, that we're not apologetic for the way in which our voices should come through. We're not apologetic in ensuring that when we are turning up, like Dr. Hau'ofa said, that we're not being put back into these spaces that determine and dictate where we're heading. As Pacifica people, we should be self-determined, and we should be able to resist those particular areas of change that are pushed upon us. So I'm going to now give you an example of how I've been involved in resisting by deconstructing our approaches. So over the last couple of years, I've been involved in a funded project called Mental Health Talanoa. And this is where we worked collaboratively with Pacific communities here in Australia and also back in the islands themselves to actually develop a shared understanding of mental health and well-being. As Professor Tewa said before, it's common that mental health as a concept is something that's completely different from Western views and ideals. So this particular project was designed with a Talanoa approach in mind. So a Talanoa, by definition, is a shared conversation or a collaborative conversation, or creating a shared space to have a conversation about anything and everything or nothing at all. It's just a safe space for people to hold and to contribute to a shared conversation about anything and everything. And so we modelled this particular approach. If you can see on the left-hand side, we modelled this approach to very much be focused on the community, with view that these particular phases of the research project weren't stages. They're actually phases that meaningfully informed each other to create a common outcome as part of our shared approach. So we called it the FRET model, F-R-E-T, so formation, research, education and training, F-R-E-T. And FRET by definition is a small wave that then has a ripple effect. So the idea was that we were doing that. That's why you can see that our particular diagram here is like waves that we see from the ocean, which then connects us all, see all the connecting points. So this again was about being able to create even research approaches and projects that were informed again by a Pacific context. And the way in which we ran the project was, again, that each of these particular phases would actually flow in and out of each other. So it wasn't actually getting from one to another to another. It was actually through our engagement with community reference group and our steering committee. They then provided feedback on how we undertook our research, how we undertook our developed community-based resources and training. And these were then also fed back directly to community, which also then informed other components associated with the research project. The other key thing that we wanted to do is ensure that there was a holistic and a broader context in which things were understood. So understanding individuals, families, community, and systems in which the research and our communities were located. So as a result of actually applying this approach, we developed a whole series of different infographics and resources that came from the project itself. One of them includes this particular middle infographic. And basically what we were doing is that we were actually surveying our community from an empirical tool to look at possible signs and symptoms associated with a common mental disorder. So traditionally we might think that a mental health illness that might be consistent or universally applied across all communities globally. Not the case at all. So different community groups, depending on their context and settings, even where they may be located, will experience a mental health illness in different ways. So this research project was, again, bringing the conversation back to our communities and looking at what were some of the common signs and symptoms that might be related to some of these common mental disorders, with view that we wanted to start an ongoing mental health talanoa, mental health conversation amongst the families as well. So it wasn't just about an individual focus, but this infographic and the information in and of itself was really positioned on the family and the wider community. Now, why is this different? Because if you look at a lot of these mental health resources that contributes to what we call mental health literacies, which is this idea of understanding mental health and well-being, a lot of it is very individually oriented and focused. And that, again, is a symptom of the Western context in which a lot of mental health discourses exist. This project, again, was privileging the way in which Pacific people view their mental health and well-being from their point of view, not a Western point of view. And I'll be honest with you, I still struggle with the idea that we did look at some of these signs and symptoms, again, calling them certain things, because, again, we do sort of see mental health more broadly in a bigger picture point of view from a Pasifika point of view. But for us, even in modernity again, how does modernity interact with Pacific people and vice versa? On the far right-hand side, then we also have a series of infographics that were developed called the Pacific Indigenous Mental Health Lexicon. And basically what we did is that we came up with some key concepts, again, related to mental health and well-being. And what we did is we got them then translated into 4 Pacific Indigenous languages, or Pacific languages that are utilised across the region. So we looked at Fijian, Tongan, Samoan, and Bislama from Vanuatu. And we worked with clinicians and practitioners directly in the Pacific Islands themselves to develop a series of terminology in language to better support the description of mental health and well-being. Traditionally, what we found in our Pacifica languages is that a lot of our terminology may be more negatively geared and stigmatizing. So for us, it was about being able to create more strength-based language to further support the shared approach associated with well-being. We didn't do Māori because there's already a lexicon associated with Te Aroa Māori, which is great, and I'd encourage people to access that. But you'll see even with these particular resources, which is available online. So literally, if you just do a Google search on mental health Talanoa or look at our socials at MH Talanoa, you'll find our resources available, which also includes a series of YouTube videos that actually explain and actually speak out these particular resources in more detail. Comments, questions? I'm conscious of time. Yes.
I just want to say, like, my question is like, so you guys done like research in different Pacific countries. Have you guys like carried it out already in like certain communities or countries? Because I totally agree with the fact that mental health is something in the Pacific that people don't talk about a lot, and it seems like a taboo topic. Or like from the Solomon Islands, we say someone is like having a mental illness when they're losing their mind, and they don't talk about it when you have like stresses and stuff. And when you talk about that, they're just like, oh, forget about it. So that's totally true. So I'm just curious, like, in terms of like from the research, actually implementing it, how does that like in the current, I don't know, like the current stage of that?
Yeah. So we've had feedback from different spaces, including clinicians from the islands and New Zealand. And they've noted that by virtue of just having these, so these infographics are A4, by the way. I've just made them small to fit on the slide. But by virtue of having these particular information sheets and putting them up in their clinics, or just pointing to them as part of a shared conversation, because again, it's about creating a mental health talanoa, a shared conversation. Both Pacific and non-Pacific clinicians have found that it has provided scope for people to start to think more about mental health being part of their broader well-being. For example, a lot of the words to describe in language health was the same word to talk about holistic well-being and health. So a lot of Pacific Indigenous languages already use the same terminology for health to describe holistic living and well-being, because health generally is holistically driven rather than siloed in all these different areas to describe what health is. So it was about being able to create a shared conversation around this with view that it was an ongoing conversation. For us, it's not about, diagnosing people, but it's about being able to create critical spaces for people, because unfortunately, this actual research project was instigated off a couple of youth suicides in Western Sydney, which was from Pacific young people. So we were starting to see this trend. So for us, it was also about being able to create a conversation around mental health and wellbeing that, again, privileged Pacific perspectives and resisted a lot of those Western modalities of understanding wellbeing. All right, let me continue on. The last one that I'm going to talk about this evening is Reclamation, which is about making a way. Okay, so this is the last area that I'm going to talk about, and then I'm going to open it up to question and answers, and even get yourselves to reflect further. So this is about being able to promote scope for Pacific people to take back what once was, to take back and teach others through these particular perspectives, for us to take time to understand how to apply this within Pasifika context, but also more broadly, and taking time to lead across spaces and places. So Reclamation, so the last two, so the first two is, yes, it's still part of that shared conversation, the first two keywords. These last two keywords is really an encouragement for Pasifika people, again, to resist and reclaim. But at the same time, I'm also suggesting, again, that it is still a shared approach, that it's about other people allowing Pacific people to exist, just like Dr. Hau'ofa was saying. Just let us still be part of the societies in which we occupy. Okay. So it is about us being able to understand where we've come from, how we might be able to apply it today, which may determine where we're going in the future. So I'll share now the example about how I've started to do this a lot more intentionally, both across my own research and practices. So I've recently published a chapter in a book, a handbook of Indigenous resilience that was put together. And I talk about this idea of exploring the role of sexuality and identity across the Pacific, navigating traditional and contemporary meanings and practices. And in this particular chapter, I am reclaiming the way in which Pacific sexualities prior to colonisation were a lot more fluid and were not labelled like we see them today. So in this chapter, I look at the past, present and future. I look at Pacific Indigenous ways of understanding sexuality, and I look at how this may then play out and how we as Pacific Indigenous people may understand this in contemporary settings. Yes, I know that there's challenges in regards to some of the other areas of colonisation, which may also include the missionaries and Christianity. I get all that. So I also talk about that in this particular chapter. But one of the things that I'm also learning is me living this out as well, being able to reclaim my own identity within these contexts. So I attended the Sydney Gay and Lesbian Mardi Gras as a representative of the University of Sydney for the first time a couple of months ago, or early last month. As someone who also identifies as queer, I myself am queer. I may use the terminology of bisexuality, but since going through all this information and learning myself what it means to understand my own previous perspectives associated with sexuality in the Pacific, I'm like, why do we continue to place labels on these particular perspectives? But more so also, this is the other point I'm making around this reclamation, around teaching others. So in this chapter, I also say that queer theory can learn a lot from Indigenous theory, including Pacific Indigenous theory, and that Western perspectives can learn a lot from Pacific Indigenous perspectives around sexuality. So my encouragement is how does Westernized spaces meaningfully learn? How can we as Pacific people help lead these sort of conversations that strive to really decrease the way in which we use labels to even demonize and stigmatize people for their sexuality and even their gender norms? So that's how I'm starting. And I've just recently written another chapter that we published in the next couple of months that looks at the way in which we understand and support Pasifika young people and their development in the context of sexuality and gender norms. So watch out for that. So yes, I further talk about the context of these particular concepts. Any comments or questions on that before
I think of the word queer as a pejorative. I know it's common usage, but it still has it's still got a bad taste to it.
Look, I agree. No, I agree. And I do talk about that, this idea of the word queer being reclaimed by the queer community. But I agree. I think this is the thing that has happened a lot in these respective spaces with labels, is that it's about how do people even move beyond those particular labels in ways that provides them with a scope to not be labelled within the labels.
Yes. So for Pacific Islander, traditionally, before the white man turned up, was a homosexual labelled in
no, so
way?
No, that's the thing.
I guess in a way we might say homosexual, heterosexual, but not these pejorative words that are used.
That's right. So
there wasn't any nasty words used.
That's right. So sexuality wasn't relegated to morality. Sexuality was part of social interactions. So in Western context, or I should have said this before, right. In Western context, sexuality is seen as this part of morality and the way in which we view and label our engagement sexually. And when the colonizers came, that's where they started to introduce the idea of our own bodies being evil based on our own practices. And then we started to learn that and we started to replicate that. So there are concerns associated with our own expressions of sexuality. And when I talk about sexuality, I'm not just talking about queerness, I'm just talking about sexuality as a site of expression as well. So that's the other key thing to keep in mind, that yes, as a result of a lot of those particular areas of development, we as Pasifika people, I think we need to, and that's what I also talk about in this chapter, we are starting to see a lot of movements across our community, both here in the diaspora and in the islands themselves, that is about the rights of the queer community, but it's more than that as well. It's also about a celebration of our queerness. That's the point that I'm trying to make as well. It's not just about rights or a movement towards inclusion. It's also about a celebration of what this might mean across our spaces and places. Okay. So I'm conscious of now this last slide. So this is really me getting everyone now to think about how can you make this happen? So how can you decolonise, desist, resist and reclaim? How can you meaningfully include diversity? How can you move away from harmful practices? How can you make a stand against injustices? And how can you make a way for change that will then create socially just and inclusive societies? So what I wanted to do, and I don't think we'll have time to do this, maybe we do have time to do this.
We've got till 6:30 and we have over 20 minutes.
Okay, no problems. What I might encourage people to do is, and thank you. Sorry, someone asked the question, how do I access this particular chapter? Yes, if you go to that ABC link that was just posted, there is I did an opinion piece on this, but then if you also go to the Sydney Uni media release on this, there is an access to the chapter. There you go, right there. Thanks, Darrell. Thank you. You can access the chapter via that link. So what I might do is, because I wanted to, and I don't think we can do breakout rooms and webinars, can we? No. That's what I wanted to do. All right, what we might do is then just allow people to make comments. So what I'd love people to do now is sort of reflect on what's up on the screen, and then provide feedback on how you might be able to do this. And then what I also want to do, so I'm going to leave this screen up. I'm going to leave this for the time being on the screen, but I also want people to also ask any questions or make any comments they would like to make. And this is an opportunity for people on Zoom to potentially raise their hands to ask questions.
We've got, just while everyone's having a moment to think, we do have an anonymous question in the Q&A that I can read out for you. So, are we softening the accountability of white people and their perpetuation of the power imbalance with Indigenous people when we say that whiteness is not about race?
Yes and no. I think whiteness is still related to, there is a racialization when it does come to whiteness in regards to white people. But for me, it's about discourses. It's about the underlying way in which we do things. So even by virtue of having this particular space set up here at the University of Sydney, now I should say University of Adelaide, and I was about to say this is very similar at the University of Sydney, and this is if you've got these grand spaces that look amazing and they look all very, very ornate. And for me, I go, okay, this is great. And how did we continue to privilege these particular spaces and uphold these spaces at the cost of Indigenous land rights? So it's not necessarily me saying that white people continue to perpetuate this. What I'm saying is that there's an underlying discourse or way of thinking or unspoken narrative that continues to perpetuate and uphold these systems and structures to privilege this over other ways of understanding space and place. That's what I'm on about mainly. And look, I know other people will call out, the white race more specifically, and all power to that's more critical race studies, but I do more stuff on critical white studies that looks at more around the discourses and power structures. Great question, thank you. Any other comments or questions, or any comments on this particular slide that's up on the screen?
I would just like to add to what you said, that as you said, that this narrative still exists, and I genuinely believe it that colonization did not end with countries just getting independence.
Oh, totally.
We are experiencing what we call the colonial hangover, that overall every societal norm and belief is still based on that white is right. I mean, if you look at the education system, as you rightfully said, that there are only 3 professors of Pasifika heritage, because most journal articles, I mean, most journals and research still would only prefer developed nations research. Anything coming out from Pacific or developing countries is not really looked nicely upon. So our education system is still primarily based on that narrative of white is right. So I think that it is not only the independence of a country, I think we need to go further and bring a equal playing field in every aspect of our life.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think this notion of white is right, it is this idea also about how we sort of, we have this unspoken acceptance that anything that might come from a Western context is accepted as being the norm. And I even found this, I've been involved in projects that would send social work students on their final year placements to the Pacific Islands themselves. And we started to send quite a large group. So we work across Fiji, Tonga, Samoa, and Vanuatu. And we had a mix of different students that will go both Pacific and non-Pacific. And what we found time and time again is that we would actually have to brief and debrief the Pacific students, especially if they hadn't worked in their own countries of origin or even just in the region, to be aware of how their non-Pacific counterparts would actually be respected more than them. Like, we specifically had to brief them on that. Because we found that by virtue of the non-Pacific students being in the agencies that would place them in the islands, they were just being seen as the experts because they're coming from a Western institution with Western knowledge, and the Pacific student was there, but they were still the lesser. So for me, what is that a replication of? What's the discourse? And again, it's that West is best sort of context that continues to be perpetuated by this notion of whiteness as well. Thank you.
I'll just add to that. During one of my recent speeches that I gave at was it ANU, or I'm just trying to remember the context, but I recently won a national award for university teaching. And one of my interviews that I gave, I told the story of how I used to take my students on field schools to the Pacific. So I take them to like Samoa, Fiji, Solomon Islands, Hawaii. We went to Palau. And when I went to Samoa, we went to the USP campus at Samoa, and they did a lovely formal welcome for everyone. And there was going to be kava, and people were sitting in a big circle in the fale, and it was all very beautiful. And I walked in with my undergraduate students, and they were like, "Where's the teacher? Where's the teacher? Where's the teacher?" And we just sort of like stood there, and we were like, you know, and so they found the tallest white girl in the group, and they were like, come forward, come forward. And we just all sort of giggled because we were trying to see who got pulled, you know, forward, because they had kava and they were trying to figure out where people should sit. So that was, you know, when we didn't respond and I didn't step forward, and we were all just sort of like, oh, it's not obvious to anyone who's actually in charge of this group. They sort of picked one and pulled them forward. So I'll never forget that. And I didn't mind, frankly, because, you know, it's always good to be in the background anyway. But that was very telling, you know, and yeah.
And it's interesting. Thanks for sharing that, because that was it within a Pacific country, right?
In a Pacific country.
And that's why I'm calling out us as Pacific people to decolonise, desist, resist, and reclaim. Because we will reproduce these inequalities as well as part of our understanding. And again, where did we learn this from? And for me, again, it's from the way in which modernity, in the context of our own engagement and development, continues to perpetuate, again, this West is best context.
So I've sort of I suppose my question, my comment was very much based on what you both said about, you know, that sort of tension between Indigenous and between in Pacifica people, where they're sort of caught between these worlds and caught between their family and their community, the culture, and those traditional cultures and ways of doing things where they value and experience that. And then they're also in a lot of contexts where where ideologies of modernity proliferate, and they've got then also those ideologies, as you've said, of telling them that the Pacific or the Indigenous way they devalues that. Do you think that in your social work that you found that tension between being caught between that causes quite a bit of anguish for a lot of people that you would have worked with, or young, or anyone, any Pacifica or Indigenous person, whether they be living in the Pacific or living in Australia or somewhere else?
Just to clarify, understanding, so the Pacific young person or other people feeling like they can claim their Indigenous perspective as part of their engagement with social workers?
Yeah, well, yeah, certainly. Do they find it tense to maybe to express that identity, or what you said? Do they find that difficult?
Yes.
In Australia or elsewhere?
Yeah. So I still do clinical work outside of my academic role. And I find that one of the reasons why I do that is there's still a need for people that look like me to be providing therapeutic support for other people that might look like me. And that then does provide scope for people. So I brought on a new client recently who said, oh my goodness, you are so different from the other counsellors I work with because you just get me. And I can just talk about who I am, and I don't have to explain it. So this is another Pacific person that I'm working with. And that helps people to feel comfortable, but it's going back to, again, ensuring that everyone is involved in decolonising their own practices in these roles or these professions, that it shouldn't just be left to me as a Pacific Indigenous person to work effectively with another Pacific Indigenous person. Everyone should be doing that. Everyone should be encouraging scope for their authentic selves to come through in a therapeutic process, not just someone that is from that background. Because it's, I literally still do this work because there's not many of me, again, from Pacific background doing this, but it's tiring. It's exhausting having to constantly turn up in these spaces because other people are not necessarily involved in understanding how they can also do the same thing, both Pacific and non-Pacific. So that's why you hear me talk about this more broadly.
Oh, thanks, Mandy. Yeah, we've just got 2 questions.
Sure.
In the Q&A function.
Awesome. So I've got the first question. Any examples of how Australian universities, academia influencing Australian aid-funded programs to prioritise Pacific ways of doing, knowing and becoming?
Is the question any examples of that?
Yeah.
I'm gonna generally say no. And it's partially because of the kinds of scholarships that are given out and the fields that often get prioritized. So this isn't it isn't to say that some areas are less or more important than others, but you will often not get a scholarship, or you won't get a lot of interest in studying a field that is about you, or a field that might be focused on culture, heritage, epistemology, the arts, anything that Epeli Hau'ofa very explicitly explored in his seminal essay from that quote, which said, these are all our strengths. These are all the fabulous and wonderful things you do. When scholarships are doled out in a development context or aid context, they're usually prioritize fields and disciplines that are deemed capacity building or developmentalist or modern in order to bring the Pacific up to white standards. So again, I have nothing against law or medicine or anything like that, but it's why we don't have that many Pacific people studying Pacific heritage and culture and epistemology and traditional ways of knowing and being and doing. So that's why these fields that are about the study of Pacific people continue to be dominated by non-Pacific scholars, non-Pacific researchers. So this is kind of an important conversation in Pacific studies generally. Yeah, so how do we bring those things together, the insights from disciplines that are focused on Pacific ways and Pacific fields that are focused on Pacific ways together, because otherwise you'll get a scholarship for IR, for something else, but not to actually study your own heritage.
And it's really interesting. My take on that question is around if we have more Pacific academics, because, you know, many years ago when you and I both started, there was maybe a handful that were at differing levels. And now we've got a growing list, right? Probably 10 or maybe 12 that are in full-time ongoing roles across the different rankings of academics rankings. There's different academic ranks. What am I saying? As a result of having more Pacific people in different disciplines, you are then by virtue going to get us turning up with our knowledges in those spaces. For example, I've been involved in quite a few projects recently where I'm able to privilege Pacific Indigenous perspectives, like that mental health Talanoa approach. But the other one is a Carver project that is being funded by DFAT, and they've brought me on board to help consult with Pacific communities on the legislation and usage of Carver in Australia. And I'm constantly turning up to jurisdictional meetings across the country saying Carver is a thing that we use and it's not a bad thing. Stop demonising Carver. And if I'm not there to say that as a Pacific person, then a lot of the time it's not said. So going to the point around if we don't support our own people to be in these spaces to actually, again, turn up. But again, it's tiring if it's just us, so please join us.
And it's hard when you're isolated because you usually need a critical mass to kind of give everyone the confidence and the empowerment to do things their ways. Otherwise, people are reproducing those discourses.
I agree. I've got another question here, and I'll continue to take them from here rather than on the chat. Yep, okay. So with regards to the slide on the further reflections, oh, great. I'm just wondering if you could say something about doing this work relationally between Indigenous Pacific Islanders and non-Indigenous people living in the Pacific in a context of enduring white supremacy and settler colonialism. I think this context can create the conditions for wanting and being more comfortable working in non-mixed spaces because it's easier. And while this division can be constructive, ultimately it also furthers division and does not prepare us to have a shared conversation with everyone. Okay.
Are they talking about settler colonial context?
I think so. So I'm just rereading the question. My interpretation of this question, and please correct me if I'm wrong by adding additional thoughts to this, is so for me, as I was saying throughout, it is a shared conversation where everyone is involved in ensuring that we are aware of our own perspectives, prejudices, and even biases. So for me, it's about encouraging people to be more aware. So I did some work a couple of years ago on how do we create scope for everyone to be part of a shared conversation? How do we get people to be more aware of their own, all those things, those biases, their prejudices? And one of the key things I write about was this idea of the epistemology of ignorance, that we're all ignorance to our own ignorance. That's the epistemology of ignorance. So it's this idea of how do we help people to stop being ignorant, including ourselves. And a lot of the answers to that is about having critical conversations. And it's ensuring people are able to have critical conversations in safe ways. I think sometimes it's very easy for us to weaponize these conversations and then go, you didn't do this and you should have done that. And I think that we can still call things out in positive ways. But one of the key things that I strive to do in my own common practices, even in my role at the University of Sydney, is to diplomatically disrupt. That's another thing I'd encourage people to do, to diplomatically disrupt. So I'm conscious of always being disruptive, but I need to do it diplomatically, because if I get angry, and I even said this to my students recently in a lecture, if I get quite assertive and I actually, get passionate about something, very easily I then become an angry person of colour. Very easily. So I've learned that I need to diplomatically disrupt in being able to bring people along with me in a shared conversation. So going back to that question, that's what I'm still encouraging people to do. We've got another 2 questions. There are numerous markers of power, privilege, and disenfranchisement that intersect with the decolonisation discourse, and agree that race is not the sole factor, as you've rightly highlighted. But do you think it is a predominant issue, especially in decolonising development in the Pacific? Yeah, I think that race still does permeate the way in which we make sense and value people and perspectives. And I think it's important though, because I know, and I'm sure, Ati, you can talk more about this in regards to different ways in which Pacific populations have, you know, privileged one over the other and versions of perspectives. But I think for me, I'm more concerned around calling out, dominant discourses that may include race. But for me, I also should also mention, I'm conscious of time, I'm going to wrap it very soon, that for me, diversity is not just based on ethnicity or race. It's also based on language and ability and sexuality and socioeconomic status. We're all of those different things. We're not just a race or ethnicity. We're also all these other things as well. So I'm encouraging that. And I think I should wrap up so that you can close.
Cool.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very-
Thank you so much, Jioji. Very generous, sharing your thoughts and your person and your stories, and allowing us into the conversation, allowing people, and we had people from right across the Pacific. Maybe we can save the chat, Rachel, and send it on, because it had people, you know, chiming in from where they were, and they were in up here and they were in Suva and, you know, all over the place. So that was fabulous. Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
So draw it to a close. See you, everybody.
Naka.
Inaka, Mose, Nofua.